Fair disclaimer, I was given this game for free, however that doesn't particularly make up for the number of Minotaur punches I've suffered. Tales of Maj'Eyal says that it's a turn-based roguelike RPG. Now the first 2 points are certainly correct, but I find the moniker of RPG to be somewhat off. It's not that there aren't any RPG elements in the game, because there certainly are. However, RPG implies story and character to be the center of the gameplay. Tales of Maj'Eyal is not a terribly story or character-driven game, which I'll go into more detail on a bit later, but is instead focused on combat elements. How I would define this game as a turn-based roguelike dungeon crawler with RPG elements. With that little technical bit aside, let's get to what this game is actually about. A player will start by having to choose from a race and a class, just like most fantasy games. However, there is a more hidden result of this decision. There is a different start for every class. A fighter might start in a forest trying to be an adventurer, while a demonic pyromancer will start as the prisoner of demons. This little mechanic was, to me, the most interesting part of the game. Having 32 classes, the different start locations allow for a wide variety of different gameplay opportunities. It is also an interesting way to address an issue of meaningful narrative in a roguelike game. By having different stories for each class, the narrative can be altered according to the player's choice, instead of just having a single generic adventure for every character. Now don't think that this system is all perfect. There is a massive difference in difficulty between different classes that makes the more difficult classes, such as the Doombringer, that killed me in about 5 seconds flat, much harder to play. By having some stories be more difficult, it creates a barrier to entry for players who want to choose classes that interest them. The next thing to consider is how the narrative is expressed to the player. For the most part, the story is expressed through notes that the player will find in the dungeons. It is quite a crude method of telling stories. The gameplay has to stop to allow for an entire wall of text to be read by the player. Personally, I don't find this method of narrative to be engaging. In fact, it acts as a method that takes the player out of the game. The stories themselves aren't even particularly compelling. I would call them fairly standard fantasy stories with acceptable levels of writing. While I appreciate the quantity of narrative experience that Tales of Maj'Eyal is trying to express, it would have been better to focus on a few stories and integrate the narrative into the gameplay elements instead of having a book's worth of narrative that is disruptive to the actual gameplay. Now, there are also characters to talk to throughout the game. They tend to be few and far between, and the dialogue is fairly standard roguelike dialogue. By that I mean it is fairly generic. All of the issues implicit in the notes are also existent in the dialogue as well. Now, for the gameplay elements, the combat is actually quite interesting. There's a standard Dungeons & Dragons array of stats that affects health, damage, resistance, etc. In addition, each class has a set of spells that they can upgrade to assist them in combat. Fighting consists of taking your turn to either attack, move, or cast a spell at the opponents. Every spell that I've used has been useful, playing a key role in how a class fights. That sounds like something that should be standard, but I've seen far too many games that end up having 2 useful spells, and the others are never used. The composition of each class shows the amount of effort that must have been put into the balance of each of them. There are some problems with combat, however. The difficulty of opponents tends to vary a lot. I've had too many instances of crushing 20 enemies, and then one enemy steps up and nearly kills me. In saying that as well, the majority of enemies in the game are exceptionally weak. It is not unusual to find yourself fighting 5 to 10 enemies and coming out of combat with little more than a scratch. That is, until you run into one of the more dangerous enemies. Now, I will say, you can see all the stats of the enemies before fighting them, and you have all the time to look at enemies' strengths and weaknesses. However, I think that this is a good time to talk about the graphics, because they can cause some problems on this front. I'm not usually a stickler for graphics. I'll always say that aesthetics are more important. But that being said, Tales of Maj'Eyal has exceptionally crude graphics. The images seem to be hand-drawn with a nearly but not quite consistent aesthetic. I was often left wondering what an enemy was until I read the name. A portion of this appears to be a byproduct of the amount of assets in the game. But what really becomes a serious issue is that 2 types of enemies can have the same image representing them. but have one be significantly stronger than the other. Really, Tales of Maj'Eyal's aesthetic is weak, and the visuals can actually get in the way of gameplay. The last thing I want to highlight is the roguelike nature of the game. When starting a game, the player can choose between having one life, a limited number of lives, or unlimited number. The game expresses that limited lives is the standard mode of play, so I'll focus on that. Each campaign, to my knowledge, as I haven't finished a campaign yet, takes multiple hours to play. Quite frankly, they seem far too long for a roguelike permadeath experience. It would have helped for the game to not focus on being roguelike, but to instead have a more built-up and flushed-out campaign. Roguelikes definitely work best when they have smaller, shorter campaigns, and quite frankly, the breadth of the campaigns in this permadeath situation doesn't play to Maj'Eyal's strengths. In the end, I don't think that I would generally recommend this game. It's an ambitious project that I don't find fully succeeded in what it was attempting. That being said, if you are a hardcore action RPG dungeon crawler fan, then this could be a good title for you to check out. The combat is certainly solid enough to have a good time with, if you're really into that kind of experience. With that, thanks for watching and, as always, enjoy the rest of your day.